3-hour session on the square root of probably correct. There are name tags out there. That's an inside joke, you know what. The quantum mechanics talks mathematically about the square root of probability and teaches you how to add or subtract. And so that's our slogan. We have an audio recorder and a video recording going on of all of this. We decided that the hats with that slogan on it are in too short supply. Everybody can take a name tag with the slogan and fill it out any way you want. But the hats will go to people who speak either at the panel or who make comments at the end of the panel. We'll keep the talks short. The second session is about a rather remarkable effect. After 4 years, I went on leave from Hampshire for a couple of years, stretched it actually to 3 years. And some of the students picked up and made a course. This is the book. Unlike me, they finished their book. This is the book that they made to carry on quantum mechanics. There are only a few things that I disagree with, but nothing that I wrote. They do this stuff about waves that I wouldn't have put in there, but never mind. And the two authors are here, and outside there are some of their evaluations of the kids who were in the class, as well as at least one Division I evaluation that they wrote as the teachers. In those days, in order to pass Division I, you had to do projects, and the projects had to be in each different school. So I'll introduce them as they go along, but we'll start with Alan Schwartzman and Bill Arnold. John Bell will speak again. If you were here last hour, you know that he teaches physics and quantum physics at the Jefferson Magnet High School in Arlington, Virginia?
Fairfax County.
Fairfax County, okay. And I'll speak a little bit because there are also courses that followed on from the quantum mechanics course that I was involved in. I'm probably the best person to speak about. So why don't we start with Alan?
So my name is Alan Schwartzman, and I went to Hampshire from the fall of '73 to spring of '77. And Herb was one of the more influential teachers while I was there, and that's remarkable considering that we only overlapped 1 year. So we just, and part of that I think is associated with his love of teaching, and as John said, in the love towards his students. And when I was in high school, I became interested in physics, and I specifically did not take the physics course in high school because it had a terrible reputation. But the chemistry teacher was excellent, and I took a lot of chemistry. But I knew I wanted to do physics. And I came to Hampshire in the fall and was disappointed to learn that the first course didn't happen until the spring. And the fact that it was quantum mechanics meant nothing to me, because I really didn't know any physics. And so, but I was anxious to meet her and to just get my name known. And so this is a funny story. I went and knocked on his door, and I hear "come in" his Brooklyn accent. And there were 3 people standing there. Maybe John was actually one of them. But there were 3 people standing there. There was Herb, I think it might have been John, and then there was this very elderly, distinguished looking man. Now elderly, he probably was in his late 40s, but to an 18-year-old. But there was this elderly, very distinguished looking man with who had a suit jacket on and graying hair. And I looked straight at him and I said, "I would like to introduce myself. I'm Alan Schwartzman, and I'm interested in taking your course in the spring." And from behind me, you know, I hear, "Oh, that's great." And I turn around and there's her looking not as distinguished as he is now. And
Not as old.
but what I've discovered over time, even you know, the fact that we overlapped only 2 semesters, not even continuous ones, is that he was very distinguished, you know, and he was very wise in his inward attitude towards you know, why he was at Hampshire and why he wanted to be there for the students. And, you know, a lot of people talked about quantum mechanics, and, you know, I actually asked to be the TA, and which Herb did, you know, allowed me to be so, and of course he gave all the warnings about how hard it would be and how much work it is, and sort of like everyone else, and John, I got to the point where, you know, I was doing all of these problems and I didn't know what it meant, and it was frustrating, but I plowed ahead anyway. And, but it must have meant something, because 2 years later, Bill and I, and Bill was in the class as well, we taught the course, in this very room actually. And it was a great experience, you know, and I chalk it up as, you know, one of the more meaningful things I did while at Hampshire. And I actually was the one responsible for the Stern-Gerlach experiment. So Bill and I were perfect, because he had his interests and I had my interests, and it just overlapped quite nicely. And
What do you do now? Did you introduce you?
no, so I'm not a physicist. You know, there's very little quantum mechanics in my life now, and but the original lecture that Bill gave, you know, in our course, and Herb gave when he taught it, was, you know, what is physics? And he basically asked a lot of back of the envelope type questions, and I sort of made a career of 2 of those questions, and one was, what happens when a knife slices butter, you know? And I had become, you know, there were many other factors obviously, but I always thought about this. I had become an atomic resolution microscopist. And so I did look at how dissimilar solids hook up on the atom by atom basis, yet they were different crystal structures on either side. And it always boils down to defects to compensate for the differences. And so there's disorder, but in a very orderly fashion. And I did that for a long, long time, until I met my wife-to-be. And I was living in Providence, and she was in Boston, and she's a freelance classical musician, and it was a lot easier for me to change one job than her to try to reestablish a whole lot of new connections. And so now I am in Boston, and I work at MIT, and the director of what's called the Nanomechanical Technology Laboratory. And the closest question and so I work on mechanical properties at the nanometer length scales. And the closest...
A nanometer is a billionth of a meter, for those of you.
What's a meter?
A yard. A meter is almost exactly 40 inches. No, this is great. So when you get altitudes in meters, multiply by 40 and divide by 12. 39.95.
So this, you know, one of the other questions that Herb asked, which I had no idea how to answer, was how deep can you dig a hole? And so I still can't answer that, but it's related to mechanics and mechanical properties. And I guess one of the neatest things that is done in my lab is we measure how much force it takes to unfold protein molecules. And it's basically a 10 trillionths of the weight you would feel from holding an apple in your hand. And that would be called 10 piconewtons. But I just, you know, I'm very grateful to be able to be here and just say that, Herb, I appreciate everything you've done, because even though we overlapped only 2 semesters, I saw him a lot more. I sought him out when he was in California and Maryland, and he was just very helpful. There are certain things he told me that are not related to physics that I still use in my life. So I'm going to stop there.
I just want to say that to most people in the audience, there's not that much difference between, what did you say, nanomechanical properties of atomic force microscopy.
Right.
It sounds like physics to us. Yeah. Next speaker is Bill Arnold.
All right, all right.
This is the book they put together on page 7 and you mistaken dimension.
Oh my gosh, I was
And then they claimed that I taught the two slits interference pattern, which you all know I would never teach. Wave two particles of waves. Anyway,
So I'm
it's
Bill.
now corrected, don't worry.
I'm Bill, and you know, it's actually the first time I've been back to Hampshire since I graduated. And
Welcome back.
I hardly remember a thing, but it's been an amazing memory sort of thing to come in here today. And we come up the drive today, and everything started flooding back, and I didn't remember the kiva. Alan kept saying, "Well, don't you remember we taught the class there?" And I was like, "No, I can't remember a thing." But now that I'm in here, I do remember. You know, so. And
What do you do now?
well, I work for a company that makes nanolithography tools. So we make tools that make very small things like integrated circuits, and we basically I do use quantum mechanics. I mean, it is so what I learned in your class actually, and I was sort of flipping through this, and actually a lot of these things we still do. So that's been helpful. Basically when I left school, I went to Silicon Valley, and I worked for chip companies to make various semiconductor devices. Semiconductors are based on quantum mechanics, and so I made processors and DRAM memories and NAND memories, SRAMs, and so forth. And these are all have quantum mechanical properties that they exploit, and and the nanolithography in particular is what you use to build up these devices, to carve out the pathways for conducting electricity. And in our business, what you have to do in order to sort of keep up with the demand and the whole flow of things is you have to continue to shrink all the time. So you have to continue to try and figure out how to get to smaller and smaller dimensions, so a lot of these chips now are, and you were talking about a nanometer, now we're making devices that are about 20 nanometers wide. So it's it's starting to get to the point where you have to, at least in some of the layers, for example, with building up the silicon dioxide layer that you have underneath the gate, it's only five atoms thick, basically. So it's this has been very valuable for me to have this kind of quantum mechanics background. As far as teaching the class, I don't remember.
Any of your students in the room? Maybe?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. But I remember I really enjoyed this, and and it looks very professional. This was before. This was clearly before everybody had Word. So everything's written out longhand, so that's what I'm interested in. But anyway, we had a great time doing this, and Alan found the class evaluations, and I gather we actually did okay in the class evaluations, and so nobody was quite as critical as her, but I guess.
Well, they didn't catch you.
No, but I think just instead of talking about nanolithography and the integrated circuits and so forth, I would like to say that when I came to Hampshire College, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I took a couple years of art classes, and I went up to Smith to take Zen Buddhism class and all this sort of thing. But somehow I don't know exactly what the thing was, but I got into Herb's class, and almost immediately I took right to that. And even though I would echo all the comments I heard this morning about this was incredibly difficult and not completely understandable what was going on. Something struck me as being, this was a great clue that people had uncovered about the way that nature works, And even if you couldn't really understand why it worked like that, the experimental evidence was overwhelming that it did work. So it was, you know, it's a great mystery that had been unlocked, and not that many years before, you know, I'd come into school. So I thought I was always struck by that, and I really never looked back after that in my career. So
Thank you.
yep.
These two guys. These two guys went to University of Chicago.
That's right.
Both of them to graduate school right after, and the squeals and squawks that I got in the late night phone calls about what they were doing to these
Oh my
guys.
gosh.
I don't know if my answers to their questions helped.
Yeah, we
at all.
lived in the student housing together, actually. So,
So the collaboration didn't end with that one semester course. We asked John to come back and talk about courses that follow up, because as he spoke in the previous hour, he actually did a little bit of gravitational general relativity research, and long story, he met his wife, Canada, America, blah, blah, blah. And ended up as a high school teacher, so he has something to say about follow-on courses. And then I'd like to go as the last speaker for a few minutes to talk about the spin-off that came, especially from the kinds of insights that Mary spoke about last hour. You may have her repeat it. So,
I think the one thing I wanted to talk about, I mean, I have taught, I taught a graduate course in quantum field theory. I've taught courses in general relativity. I've taught this and that and the other thing. But the one I want to talk about here is actually the thing which is probably most derivative or devolved or whatever from basic physics. And so I teach this class. In my high school, they actually had a course in modern physics, which is a sort of a survey course of phenomenology, which is a traditional course that people, you know, so people don't have much direct experience of sort of, you know, atomic processes, and so they would. There's this course which existed for a long time about really phenomenology. And I wanted to, you know, have the kids do very exceptional students, very exceptional students, you know, they're blowing through high school as fast as you can imagine, and a great number of them have time and energy and desire to learn some deeper physics. And there was no real quantum mechanics course, so I proposed a straight-out quantum mechanics course, and at which point the teacher who was involved in the modern physics course seriously objected, because he was already teaching quantum mechanics. And I went, okay. So how about if I teach a computational physics course? And that sounded good to everybody. And so I said, okay, fine. So I started teaching a computational physics course about quantum mechanics. And so the paradigm in this course is a little bit interesting. How it works is, everybody comes into the course has some programming experience, and you know they already know how to some computer language or so, or two or three. Though nowadays I'm sort of using Mathematica a little bit more, but it doesn't matter. And the basic idea of this is I'm sort of mimicking a lot of the structure of quantum mechanics for the million. So in this course, you can imagine a model in which Herb is saying things which people barely understand. They are working very hard to figure out what he's meaning in this, and then and they are trying to learn how to make predictions about how a system will actually behave. And, you know, and that's what he's trying to teach them how to do. And hopefully, then he's hoping secretly on the side that they get it about how bizarre that is and what that means. So my little paradigm model course is what we do is I help the students learn. I mean, we do Stern Girl like Fluid Puke, and we do two-state systems like crazy, different physical examples. And then for they have a test that they have to take, in which they have to make very rapid predictions about what will happen in various three-stage Stern Gerlach things. Which, you know, if they had to do by hand, they'd have no choice. So they couldn't do it. It takes too long. So they have to write code that will allow them. They have to create a quantum calculator for themselves that will allow them to propagate this and answer, you know, these things. So they have about a week to do that. And to write the code is very intense. They finally get basically their whole grade for essentially a whole quarter depends on it. So they sweat bullets and they write this code, and then they come in and so the idea there is that they're essentially, by writing this code, they are essentially teaching the dumbest thing you can imagine, okay, how to be able to make predictions about what will happen in fairly, I think complicated scenarios. And then, step by step, inch by step, and then they have to be sure that that thing actually is making actual, is getting the right answers. In order to do that, because the grade depends on what it does, because the calculator's got to give the right numbers. So you're screwed if it doesn't. So, so they have to check. In order to check that, they have to, of course, work it out again all for themselves to make sure that it all agrees. They collaborate on making that happen, and it's because they produce a whole bunch of test cases to make sure, because they don't trust me, and I think I'm going to give them the most complicated, nastiest one, when in fact I'm not. I don't believe that until the last moment. And then they do that. And so we go through that, actually ratcheting it up more and more and more as they build these computational tools. Right now they are emailing me the final output of the final project, which I will be looking over as we get back, which is two-particle interacting fermion model in 2 dimensions, to make it say, which is pretty complicated and thing to get out, and in which they have spent a month on. So I actually, in sort of trying to think about how to design this, I tried to import the dynamic as much as I could, okay, into that process.
Yeah. You mean the teaching dynamic?
Yeah, the teaching dynamic, but actually we're there the teachers in some sense of building this thing. I mean, I do a fair amount of stand-up imitations, but anyway, that's my little story about that course.
Thank you, John. Thanks, John. So there was a chance that one of my colleagues who worked with me in research would be here now. He had a kind of conflict earlier, and he may make it to the third hour. Lee Spector worked with me on one of the offshoots of my work in quantum mechanics as a research physicist. And after we published a couple of papers, at that time I was lucky enough to have a postdoctoral student working with me. So after we published 3 or 4 papers that were new things that no one could do in quantum computation, he decided that he needed some research assistants of his own. And for a while, Hampshire was the only college, it's still on the books, so we may teach it again, the only college that offered 2 courses in quantum mechanics for freshmen without prerequisites. Because there was one in real quantum mechanics, that these guys are talking about, which I kept teaching, and another one that Lee Spector was teaching on how to program quantum computers, which don't exist, but they're very important. Okay, so the real follow-up, I wanted Mary to repeat just that segment about the spikes of knowledge, if you would, for a second, and while you're doing that, I'll look for it.
All right, so if I get it right this time, that's my...
You can say whatever you remember.
Oh, okay, well, in the last hour, for those of you who weren't here, I was supposed to talk about what I remembered about taking Herb's course, and to boil it down, what I said I remembered was none of the things that probably Herb wanted me to remember, namely what quantum mechanics was, how it worked, what it was all about, because I didn't get any of that on the first time through. But what I did remember was Herb saying that, talking about how knowledge grows, and that our general image is that knowledge is a sort of a ball and it expands. And so it's very isotropic, expands in all directions, because nature, that's what we're learning about nature, we learn everything about nature. And that, but Herb's model was that it looked much more like a porcupine with these spikes. And that what happens is we learn something about this, and so since we know a little bit of something about that, we learn something more about that because we have something to build on. And so actually there's if you want to use the sphere analogy, what we have are all these spikes that come out of the sphere in pretty unpredictable directions, and those things keep growing. We keep adding to that knowledge, but in between those spikes are huge valleys. And what for me was a really interesting idea, and particularly the valleys. And that is, how did the spikes start to grow? It was pretty clear how the spikes continue to grow, because once you've learned something, you're propelled to want to learn something else about that. But but more interestingly, how do spikes start in the first place, or how do you ever get off a spike and get down into a valley so you can grow a new spike? And what Herb taught me, maybe not in that first course, but at some point, was that that's really a cultural question. That's not a scientific question per se. That where the spikes start are really cultural decisions. So that there's this continuing conversation between science and the culture in which it's embedded. And the science affects the culture, and the culture affects the science. And there is no real way to tease those apart. So that's what I said last hour.
Great.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to read it, and I stand corrected. You would never doubt Mary Jane. It has the pincushion. As well as the porcupine.
But was she paying attention?
Oh, what? And the amazing thing is, she's talking about the 70s, although she doesn't look at that's when she took the quantum mechanics course. And we didn't get it together to do New Ways of Knowing, which is another spin-off course that I still teach today, until the 1980s. This book was published in '87, and here's what it says. Thus, what looks to us like a sphere of scientific knowledge more accurately should be represented as the inside of a highly irregular and spiky object. I gave a few examples, like E. coli is the only thing we really know at this point, all the genetics of. And neurons, we only know the giant squid axon at that time. And it's still, to a certain extent, it's really true. If you get a model system that works, that's what you base all of your knowledge on. You just check it in a few cases that maybe it's general knowledge, and then you say, oh, now we know all about genetics of everything. Okay. Should be represented as the inside of a highly irregular and spiky object, like a pincushion or porcupine, with very sharp, notice, you got the first one, not even very sharp extensions in certain directions and virtually no knowledge in immediately adjacent areas, which she characterized as the valleys. If our intellectual gaze would shift slightly, it would alter each quill's direction, and suddenly our entire reality would change. So you're supposed to picture this pincushion or porcupine, and this is our current knowledge. And now, as if it were a double exposure, imagine that different values or different presidents or something magic or something cultural actually came in, and it shifted a little. You might have an entirely different world. And then I go on to criticize the implicit values, which aren't mentioned as determinants, and the politics around Lederberg's choice of the Volvoing and so on. So that's one of the spin-off courses, New Ways of Knowing. But the conferences that led up to our publishing this book, and it's a collaborative book with Noam Chomsky and Susan Buck-Morse and a number of other famous people, actually gave us a project to do. And the project is the ISIS Institute, which still exists. And the idea of the project is, let's look at that porcupine or pincushion and figure out how to use the fact that values determine the direction of knowledge to do something different in the world. So if you'll pick up one of each of these things that we have laid out here, you'll get an idea historically as well as culturally. And finally, after 5 years of the Institute, which is now about 12 or 13 years old, we wrote a book on what we did in the project. The project included some things in biology, some things in physical sciences, stuff up here in America, and stuff down in the third world, and a wide-ranging. So I guess both of these books, New Ways of Knowing and Muddling Through, are available from the ISIS Institute. So be sure that you collect some of all of these, and if you speak, make sure you get a hat to go with it, and we may have a few left over that we'll give as prizes. The last thing I want to talk about, and there was someone in the break who spoke to me about
me. I read that. That's so great.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
Doug Peebles had the exact opposite experience of this particular editorial. The famous physicist at Amherst, Bob Romer, was the editor for many, many years of an important journal, the American Journal of Physics. And he took it onto himself after watching this quantum mechanics nonsense going on down the road for many, many years, to take the opportunity when the guy who's now actually full professor of physics in University of Virginia switched from Hampshire to Amherst because he took my quantum mechanics class and then followed up with Everett Hafner's optics and holography. So we were learning all the endpoints first, and he couldn't believe it, and he wanted to get back to normal. And Romer so he became an Amherst product. He hasn't answered his emails. I'm trying to get him to come to this thing. So you might want to pick up this, what my assistant said was a hilarious editorial. And Romer was all over himself in declining my kind invitation to this thing, to say you must read the last paragraph where he says it's okay, you can do it Herb's way. Not Gordon Cates' name doesn't appear and Herb's name doesn't appear. It's just signed by Bob Romer. But this is very, very interesting from the point of view of follow-on. So I think that's all I want to say, and I hope I didn't go over 10 minutes. And now we'd like to use the talking stick to take any questions and pass it around. John, I want to do Doug first.
In the interest of getting ahead, I'll follow up on, I need these days. I'll follow up on, this is hysterical, because I went up to Herb and I said, you know, I was pre-med and I had to fill a physics requirement.
Say who you are, dude.
Doug Peebles, 72F, and Doogie, some knew me back then. I still go by Doogie.
And you currently?
Doogie works still.
No. What do you do?
I'm an anesthesiologist. I
There you go.
specialize in pediatric anesthesia. And I left here, went to Harvard Medical School, trained in Mass General, pediatrics and anesthesia, and now practice pediatric anesthesia. So I did okay here. But when I went pre-med, I said, Joe, geez, I got to take physics. Holy shit, this is going to be terrible, because it was hard for me in high school. And you know, I went into the room with all these eggheads, and I said, Jesus, I can't do this calculus. I'm not as smart as these people. So I said, well, I'll just take an introductory physics course then. So I signed up over at Amherst College. I figured I could do that there, and went in Romer's course. And my God, it was just so boring. And you know, there was just no life to it at all. And all these Amherst kids, their only interest was getting the best grade they could. They wouldn't show me their lab notes, you know, when I took physics, and they were incredibly competitive. And it was just a drag. And I dropped out of it. And I later went there and I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm interested in being a doctor. I don't know how I'm going to survive physics. So take my course. And I said, quantum mechanics, I don't know anything about that. And so I took the course and survived it, and loved Feynman and loved Herb, and he was great. And then I did an astrophysics sort of independent project on black holes, and survived it. And it's just ironic, because here this guy says in this article that you have to take introductory physics to become a physicist. If that had gone that way, I wouldn't have never made it as a physician if Herb had allowed me to do quantum mechanics. So.
John. Maybe Mark has something to say.
I don't know if Herb remembers me from college. I was an idiot when I was here also. I was at 72 as well. But part of the whole Hampshire experience for me was learning how to look at the world and how to kind of discern how much is the real world and how much is what we perceive. And Herb was really instrumental in helping me figure that out. I remember an incident in his class where he was talking about the uncertainty principle, which is that you can't know the actual position and the direction of movement of a particle at the same time. But he used that computation to explain the force that holds an electron into the nucleus. And so he went through this whole explanation about the physics and the math about it, and then he said, so what that means is that the reason the universe doesn't fly apart is because people can't know two things at the same time. And that whole conundrum of what's real and what do you know and what can't you know and all that has been with me, you know, the whole time, and it's been just thrilling. So I came to say thank you. Thank you.
You can't get a hat without a couple of newsletters.
Okay.
Color, picture, everything it does around the world. Or did. It's quite bizarre. Anyone else? Chris?
Oh, well, just a brief one. I'm actually surprised that nobody's mentioned Jerry Garcia yet. Maybe I was the only one.
Oh, it's out there.
Okay, but I was definitely in the camp who watched her at the whiteboard, blackboard, whatever we had, I guess it was a whiteboard. And as I watched her I would having these interchanged visions of watching Jerry Garcia noodle on his guitar and vice versa. So that was also part of the fun.
So outside in the historical table, there's a couple of letters. One is from me to something called Ron Smith Productions, when I was at the Institute for, no, yeah, did I go back to the Institute for Legal? Anyway, and I was proposing myself as a Jerry Garcia double. You can't see it now. There are some pictures of me.
No, definitely.
If you look at this, right,
As it is, it happens.
which is the flyer for the event, and you look at my frog book picture there, or the other side, you may see a resemblance. And they wrote back, and those two letters are out there somewhere, and they said, send us some 8x10 glossy photos. Like I was some kind of movie star. Personality.
Like you already
impersonator.
had your head, you already had your head, send your headshots.
That's it. I got to the stage of send your headshots. I think I sent them, and then I discovered that they paid like $50 a year. It's terrible. You can even make more money teaching college.
Not at $1 a year.
Oh, the first year,
Yeah.
we knew that would come out.
Yeah.
You want to tell that story?
Oh, okay, let's compare let's test my memory. So as I understand this, this, by the way, let me just say at the beginning that they owe you.
They owe me big time.
Yeah. So when Herb applied for this job, I guess they're hiring physics faculty. Correct me anytime.
Yeah, they were not hiring physics.
Yeah, well, so they were in this expansion phase, right? And I needed faculty, and it was very, very hard. So this is 1969, right? I think, and it's very hard to get a job. I mean,
And I was in Europe.
yeah, physics. Also, the physics.
70.
There had been a very, you know, these things go in fits and starts. And there have been lots of people sort of coming out in physics and gotten a lot of professorships, and there really weren't any jobs out there. I mean, I'd say negative numbers of jobs actually. And Herb, this is, I actually never asked, so I can hear the answer.
Okay.
Is so Herb applies, and you know, and in a fit of clever advertising, which, you know, how clever is this? He applies, and apparently in the front of the cover letter, right? The cover
Oh, and that second page, so you had to read it.
second page, oh, right, he said, you know, I worked my first year for $1. Yeah, and they took him up on it. This is the part that I don't get. It's like, I go, yeah, and and halfway through the year I go, we think you might be one of eating something now. You know, so no.
I can tell it.
Jamie.
Okay.
The way Lynn Miller tells it, another professor from the start in NS, is that Herb sent out this cover letter to several or a few other universities as well where he was seeking teaching positions, but he included that caveat on the second page. And so the whole idea was that, you know, they had to read the full letter. Well, no one from the other universities read the whole thing. They got to the end of the first page. And of course, Lynn's moral of the story is that he says never write a cover letter longer than 1 page because they won't read the other side. Well, Lynn Miller was the dean of natural science that year, and he received, or was working on the review board, and looked at the letter and read the last page and said, we have to take this man, he'll work for $1. And so they took him.
Okay, I'm going to tell you the real story.
Let me tell you, no. The other part of this, every day when Herb would come for lunch, all right, he would bring a can of sardines with mustard and maybe some rice, was it, or something else to put on. And he would heat up this can of these stinking,
No.
yes.
You didn't have to heat
Yes,
it.
I mean, right, he didn't heat it up, right. He
It's
would dump
stank.
these things together and eat them, and I'm going, this poor schlub, you know, it's like doing this. And I have to tell you that now I keep a stack of these cans of mustard sardines in my cupboard. And whenever I just got to go back to the basics, I go open one of these things up and I slop it on some rice and I go sit in the corner and go, I remember this. But it's like, and the point is that's like $1.50, right?
Yeah.
That's like $1.
Still, you can imagine what it was in 1971.
Yeah.
So here's the real story. And just to give away the punchline first, I still have the $1 in question. So, yeah, that's the core of the story. I applied to Hampshire on the basis of an article in the Whole Earth catalog, which some of you are old enough to know. And they described this and other places as very innovative, interdisciplinary places. And this was when it was tough to get a job, and that was in '69 when I was finishing at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. When I came eventually for an interview, because they didn't have any students in '69, and they didn't have any faculty except for the planning faculty and deans, I found the letter, because I purposely wanted to know why they never answered my letter when I was at a more prestigious place. And then Mary and I actually got married during the year that I applied to Hampshire. And it was on our trip back home from Belgium that I interviewed. And I remember this was the room that they used for the natural science meetings. And Kim Saul, who someone mentioned earlier, is the younger brother of one of my closest friends, still to this day, a very brilliant physicist. And Kim was in the room, because they let the students be part of the interview process for all the people who came by. So the dollar on the second page was Lynn's recollection of what the dean, Everett Hafner, said. And he said that I had to read all the way through, and then I saw this dollar. And the reason I offered to work for $1 a year was that Mary wanted to go to, she'd been schlepping around with me in Cambridge, Mass, and then in Belgium. And I wanted to go to a place where she could do what she wanted to do, and she wanted to go back to school to become an artist or a cartoonist, actually, and there was this brilliant program up at UMass for that. So there were 2 places that I sent these letters to, not a million. And both of them actually asked me eventually, but the University of Wisconsin at La Crosse or something like that, LaCroix or somewhere, which was supposed to be ecological university, didn't get their act together to be founded in time. And then they didn't become an interdisciplinary ecological university at all. But Hampshire, under Everett Hafner's guidance, was smart enough to pick up, and we were getting married in Cambridge, and we came out here, and he blew my mind with a few mind tricks.
Ah, yes.
He walked,
I took a whole course based on that.
He walked through the double projector equipped East Lecture Hall while Ray Coppinger was giving this fabulous lecture on Batesian mimicry. But anyway, most of you don't know what that refers to, but it was very impressive. This was the only guy I ever saw who could teach better than I could, so that's why. And so I went to work for $1 a year. Mary did go to the University of Massachusetts. She got her bachelor's in fine arts and eventually became an artist, so everything worked out. But towards the end of the first year, I had applied for a job as that year ended, and I got this very weird memo from the treasurer of the college. And I said, "Come in and see me." Then he said, "I notice you haven't been paid." It's $1, and no one paid you. And there's something behind that. At the end of World War II, a lot of physicists went to work for the government, and they were called $1 a year men because they had other sources of support, and for $1 a year, they could make a legal contract that they would give their unbiased advice to the government. And that related to my letter, so it was good that the dean was a physicist, because I said I didn't need any money because I could drive from here to the Hudson Institute, which is where I was already an established policy consultant. So there are more stories about policy consulting, which we won't confound this. But Ken Rosenthal then called me in with this memo. The Ken Rosenthal, who's still on the board now, was the treasurer. He gave me $1, which is framed in my rather cluttered office at home. And he wrote a memorandum to the president saying, "Dear Chuck, I have covered out of pocket Bernstein's first year salary. Would you please do the same for the second?" So I don't know if I have the letter, but I have it. If there's anyone else with a last comment, that'll be the end of this session, and we encourage you to make that comment to get a hat.
I would like to say something, but I'm afraid that I'll end up with a hat, so could an exemption be made where I
Well, you know,
I'd be actually, you know what? I love the hat, and if anybody else.
That's what I was about to
wants the
suggest.
hats, just the first person to raise their hand. Okay.
Steve Bierman.
Hi, I'm Steve Bierman, and I need this talking stick. So first, I have to say that as the first employee of ISIS, I know that it must have started at least 18 years ago, not 12.
No, it was
13
incorporated.
years. Okay,
Yeah.
incorporation, if that's where it begins. It was incorporated 12 or 13 years ago. I just want to say that I think it's really unfortunate that Herb still teaches physics, and really fortunate that he teaches new ways of knowing, because clearly not everybody wants to spend time learning how to do matrix algebra with complex numbers, but the stuff that he's teaching really is not about physics. So I quickly abandoned physics after spending a couple years with Herb, but have continued to see everything in the world as the inside of an irregular spiky object, whether it's a porcupine or a pincushion, and this is not a metaphor that just applies to, I'm going to try to talk like Herb for a moment, where I say some things that sort of fit together and seem like they're really meaningful and significant, but you're not really sure by the end what it is exactly that I've said, but you're kind of inspired by it. I'm going to see if I can do that. So I see everything as that, and it's not just that fields of specialized knowledge will sort of pick up a particular area where there's something that's already known and build on that and leave these big gaps, and if you could just sort of shift your angle of the quills, your whole reality will change. It's been incredibly relevant in my work as a counselor to see that individuals do that we build our way of organizing our experience of reality in the same way as we organize knowledge, and that it doesn't necessarily take much to get people to shift how they see, where the holes are, where the valleys are. There's a whole other, pin that you can sort of build on, and organizations are the same way. And so I have been thoroughly contaminated by Herb and seeing everything in every field that I've been a part of in counseling and psychology as the inside of an irregular spiky object. And with that, I would like to offer this hat to you across the way there. All right, thank you.
Yeah, you can't avoid that. All right, we'll take a little break and we'll have the last hour in, what time is it right now?